Good morning. This week we'll end our Wednesday reflections for the summer. Since we've been spending time hearing about the different kings that were appointed, this week we will hear about how David is finally appointed king over Israel and Judah. It's been a very long road since the day that Samuel anointed him when he was just a boy. You will recall a few weeks ago the call of David, the young shepherd boy who was the underdog, the one out in the fields tending the sheep, the son that was not brought before Samuel to be considered for the role because he just didn't seem to be the right choice. It made much more sense that David's oldest brother, who was stronger, would be the obvious choice. But as we watch the story unfold, we find out that God had different plans for what should lead the people. And so David was finally brought forward and anointed by Samuel. David didn't actually become king right away after Saul's death over all of Israel. In order for us to really understand what is going on in this reading for today, it is important for us to understand that this happened in Israel since Saul's death. After Saul was killed at Mount Gilboa, David went to Hebron, and there he served as king over the tribe of Judah for 7.5 years, I read. A commentary that I listened to about this time pointed out that during the first years, the other 11 tribes followed a leader named Ishmael, who was one of Saul's surviving sons. Ishmael was made king by Abner, who had been one of Saul's chief military officers. It seems that in this case, that Ishmael was king in name only, and Abner held all of the power. I read that Ishmael and Abner carried on a sort of civil war with David's troops. This commentary went on also to point out that David did his best to stay out of these battles. It seemed that he early understood that if he ever wanted the other tribes to trust him, that he would have to stay out of the early conflicts. Before our reading today, we would read how David was growing stronger. He was taking on more wives and having children by each of them, who were mainly sons. We would have also read that as David's house became stronger and stronger, that Saul's would at the same time be becoming weaker and weaker. First, one of David's men killed Abner, and then also Ishmael. David has these two men killed because of those who had previously killed Saul. David seemed to be sending the message that it's never okay to kill the king. No one would be rewarded for that. It seems that David's biggest concern that is he is blameless in his house as well as Saul's. Now, after Ishmael and Abner have been killed, the other tribes have no one else to turn to as their king other than David. And that is where we enter the story today. Let me share with you the reading. This is taken from the New International Version of the Bible. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people, and you will become their ruler.' When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and Judah 33 years. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. He built up the area around it from the terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. As we heard, David is anointed as king in Hebron. Hebron, however, was so far removed from all of the tribes that he decided to move to a small part of land that was more central to all of the tribes. It was a piece of land that neither Israel or Judah had claimed. At the time, with what was ruled by the Jebusites, and I read that it was set up high on a large hill. From this viewpoint, it would be easy to defend. David and his men managed to take the city away from the Jebusites, and it becomes known as Jerusalem, the city of David. As a commentary I listened to pointed out, David did not conquer the city of Israel or Judah but for himself. I read further that he actually took Jerusalem by attacking its water system, which was the very heart of the city. So David has not really been the most compassionate of leaders. Eventually, it would become the city where the Ark of the Covenant would be placed, and so it is where God resides. The reading we heard today ends with the description that David becomes stronger and more powerful because of the Lord God Almighty was with him. And so in the text, we see the qualities of a great leader. That is, even here, there have been some questionable ways that he managed to pull this off. David understood that he could not be a part of every little conflict, but he worked to make himself strong in the ways that mattered in his culture. I think it's also worth pointing out how important it is for those in the community to be a part of this. These tribes of Israel had accepted David early on, but the other 11 had to come to a place where they trusted him too. The community had to affirm that they stood with him before he was anointed as king over all the tribes. And I cannot finish too without pointing out that David was not without flaws. David seems to have embraced all parts of the story to get where he needed to. He could be heroic in one moment, cruel in the next. He wrote beautiful songs and was horrifically unfaithful. He embraced the good and the bad and even the ugly. And through it all, David knew that God's grace was present through it all because David's heart was with God. So God was faithful even when he wasn't. And so for me, I finish with this thought that we each need to embrace our own stories, all the parts, leaving nothing out. I know I'm not perfect, and that's okay with God. Even David, a man who experienced much heartache and failure, understood the extent of God's love, as we hear in the words of Psalm 66, which says, "Praise be to God, who has not rejected my prayer or withheld his love from me." And we need to know that God is with us, you and me, through all the parts, when our hearts are connected to God. May you find the means, the way forward for this day and each day as we travel through these summer months, knowing that God walks with us. Thanks be to God. Amen.